Within the past century, submarines have become some of the most vital ships of a modern fleet. This is primarily due to their effectiveness through both world wars, where they were capable of crippling both merchant and naval fleets of enemy nations while remaining nearly invisible. Ever since their mass adoption within the past 140 years, submarines have advanced so far that they are capable of carrying entire nuclear arsenals while remaining hidden. When one thinks of a modern submarine, they will likely imagine the massive boats of the US and Soviet/Russian navies that stay at sea and remain underwater for months at a time. However, submarines were not always able to do this, and prior to and during World War II were essentially surface ships with the ability to submerge for short periods of time. For example, one of the most well-known submarine classes from the war, the American Gato class, was only able to stay underwater for at most 48 hours with a speed of 2 knots. The Type 7 U-Boat, the most common of the Kriegsmarine, was only capable of about 14 to 24 hours of submerged operation. With this, you might be asking when submarines changed from being opportunists to the advanced silent hunters that we know today. Well, that is the subject of today's video, the German Elektroboots, the Type 21 and 23 classes. Of all the theaters in World War II, one of the most well-known is the Battle of the Atlantic, which pitched the Allied navies against the submarines of the Kriegsmarine, arguably the only successful branch of the German Navy during the war. In the early years of the war, Germany's submarines were able to act with impunity due to both poor Allied tactics in terms of protecting merchant ships and the fact that the technology in order to detect and eliminate submarines was still relatively primitive. During this time, the most common submarine used by the Kriegsmarine was the Type 7 U-Boat, which was nothing special in terms of its design. In fact, the Type 7 was a continuation of World War I designs. The Type 7 was well liked by their crews due to their relatively small size and ability to dive faster than larger submarines, although this size led to limited fuel storage and therefore limited range. More importantly, this also led to less time underwater. Type 7s notably operated on the surface, scanning the sea using binoculars or in later years radar, and then diving when targets were spotted. This need to stay surfaced most of the time presented danger to the boats as they had limited anti-aircraft capability and were easily destroyed by heavy weaponry. One solution that was implemented was the use of a snorkel, which was mounted to the sail in order to be able to stay above the waves. The snorkel allowed the diesel engines of the sub to continue operating even underwater. While this let the boat stay submerged, it was still not impervious to detection. By 1943, the tables had turned on the wolf packs of the Atlantic. New advancements in sonar had been developed, with both ship-mounted systems and even planes being equipped with it in the form of sonobuoys. This effectively made the entire ocean potentially hazardous for a submarine, especially the U-boat fleet of Germany, which was still made up of Type 7s and its successors like the Type 9. The main problem, other than the limited range and fuel mentioned earlier, was that these submarines were also very loud and easily detected by hydrophones. This, combined with previously mentioned flaws, meant that nearly the entirety of Germany's submarine fleet was rapidly becoming obsolete. However, as normal with Germany, a solution had already been in the works since early 1943. The Type 21 was a revolutionary change in submarine design, with nearly every system being a significant improvement over previous German designs. The most notable difference externally between the Type 21 and earlier designs was the new sleek shape, with every aspect of the hull being streamlined to better perform underwater. Not a single piece of equipment was allowed to cause potential drag, with snorkels, periscopes, and radar masts being streamlined into the sail. Even the anti-aircraft armament was made to conform to this design, with 2 turrets on the front and rear of the sail being very small and nearly conformational with the sail itself. The deck gun was removed and the forward hydroplanes were able to retract when not diving. This also helped with its acoustic signature, reducing it significantly to levels of smaller boats. The pressure hull, the portion in which the crew lives and operates in, was made out of steel that was 1 inch thick, which allowed the boat to dive upwards of 240 to 280 meters, 787 to 918 feet. Sources debate whether or not this depth was tested, but if this claim is correct, this would have meant that these were the deepest capable subs in the world at that time. Another important difference in the hull was the way in which the boats were constructed, with 9 sections being built separately before being assembled together for final delivery. This was especially important for Germany, as the increased Allied aerial bombardments made it difficult to construct a boat in one spot. These 9 sections were able to be constructed in different locations, reducing the risk that the entire boat could be destroyed in one bombardment. In addition, this modular construction allowed the boats to be built in about 175 days, as opposed to the roughly 300 for a Type 7. These changes in the outer design of the boats significantly improved their underwater capabilities, allowing them to easily outrun many enemy surface ships, and even reach deeper depths to avoid sonar. However, it was when combined with the new internal components that the submarines really changed the game. In the time before nuclear propulsion, the main way of moving while submerged was the usage of electric motors that would drive the propellers without the need for the diesel engines. Not only were the diesel engines very loud, but before the adoption of snorkels, there was no way for the engines to breathe while submerged. Due to this, submarines would have massive packs of battery cells that would be charged by the diesel engines while on the surface. Anyone that has had experience with electric vehicles can already see what the problem with this was: the range. Moving a 2+ ton car already puts a drain on batteries today. Imagine propelling a 500+ ton ship through the water in the 1940s. This was made even worse by the fact that the submarines often would have relatively small battery banks due to the size of their pressure hull, leaving them with the aforementioned limited range while submerged. Being designed primarily for underwater patrols, the Type 21 offered significant upgrades to the previous boats. These ships had nearly 3 times the amount of batteries than the Type 7. Earlier, the American Gato class was used as an example of the average modern submarine during the war, with a submerged endurance of about 48 hours. For the Germans, it was about 14 to 24 hours for most of their submarines. The Type 21, however, was projected to be able to stay underwater for an impressive 75 hours at low speed due to its larger battery banks. This would have been unimaginable prior to the war, when submarines were seen as just submersible boats. As with all submarines of the time, the boats were equipped with multiple sets of engines and motors. For surface movement, they used 2 MAN 6-cylinder diesel engines that were able to produce 3,900 horsepower. These engines were supposed to be supercharged, but sources state that some of them did not have the superchargers. However, the diesels are not the most impressive part. These subs were not only able to stay underwater for impressive amounts of time, but they were also capable of reaching incredible speeds underwater. Their electric motors had significantly more power, producing about 5,000 horsepower. During tests after the war, the boats were able to reach speeds of about 15.9 to 17 knots while submerged. The majority of Allied submarines during and at the end of the war were only able to reach about 8 to 9 knots while underwater. However, this speed would only be useful in combat situations, as the batteries were estimated to be drained in about 90 minutes at this speed. For situations in which they needed to be silent, and for when the batteries were recharging, the subs also had 2 223 horsepower creep motors that would keep it moving but with little sound, sometimes being described as completely noiseless. Another advancement that was to be fitted to the Type 21 but was abandoned later in the building cycle was the usage of the Walter turbine. The Walter turbine was created by Dr. Helmuth Walter, an engineer who first patented the idea of using hydrogen peroxide to create an air-independent propulsion system. The chemical makeup of hydrogen peroxide allowed it to react with a catalyst and quickly break down into oxygen and steam at very high temperatures, leading to high pressures that could in turn move a propeller. You may find this idea familiar because Walter designed the engine for the Me-163 Comet using his studies with chemicals. The mixture that he wanted to use in these systems was named perhydrol, and with this substance he believed that it presented the opportunity to make very small motors capable of driving ships at incredible speeds. In 1934, he brought his idea to the Kriegsmarine, proposing a 300-ton U-boat with a surface speed of 26 knots and a maximum submerged speed of an incredible 30 knots. At that time, the fastest German submarine was only capable of 11 knots on the surface and 7 underwater. As can be expected, the idea was seen as too unconventional and was rejected until, in 1939, his idea was able to get a contract through the help of Karl Donitz. His first prototype, the V80, in 1940 was able to reach 23 knots underwater, and this impressed the Kriegsmarine so much that they approved the construction of a new small class of submarines. His propulsion design was also going to be put into the Type 21 and Type 23, however it was decided that they would instead use large battery packs rather than his system. The Walter turbine would be adapted after the war, but we will get back to that later. Now that we understand the advantages the Type 21 had at its disposal on the battlefield, how did it differ from other subs in its armament? The submarine, naturally, was armed with torpedoes, however, it was how they were stored and loaded that makes it really unique. If you have ever been in a museum submarine or have seen them from shows and movies, you likely know what a torpedo room looks like. Racks of torpedoes on either wall with equipment to help push the torpedoes into the tubes. The loading of a torpedo often took significant amounts of time due to the confined spaces and weight of the weapons, each being 1.5 or more tons. It was also dangerous to engage in reloading during combat, so submarines would often have a salvo loaded in the tubes and then fire off all loaded tubes before retreating and reloading. For the Type 7s, it could take up to 10 or more minutes to reload just one tube, leading to reloading all 4 tubes going over 40 minutes. The Type 21s did away with this system entirely, instead opting for what can be considered an early autoloader. Unlike earlier submarines, which also used torpedo rooms for crew berthing, these subs dedicated the entire section to the autoloader. The system used multiple racks of torpedoes which were slightly angled and aligned into each of the 6 torpedo tubes. 17 positions were present for each torpedo, allowing 3 to be empty in order to allow for additional loading, and the system would hydraulically push the torpedoes into the tubes. With this system, the Type 21s were capable of launching 18 torpedoes in under 20 minutes, only taking about 1 minute per torpedo. Being able to launch an impressive amount of torpedoes in such a short time is important, however, a submarine needs to be able to detect its targets in order to do so. This is another aspect of the Type 21 that was a great improvement over previous subs. For prior German and other submarines, the method of identifying targets would often be the use of sonar and then the use of the periscope in order to determine the target, its speed, and direction. The Type 21 no longer required this due to the new sonar array installed in the bow, which can be seen on this diagram. They were equipped with 2 systems, the passive Gruppenhochgerät, which was used for general listening, and the more sensitive active system known as the Nebelung SUR. The importance of the SUR is that it was able to determine the direction and range of targets. This meant that the submarine could track and engage its target without even needing to reach periscope depth and risk detection. Another system that was planned but never actually implemented was Project Ursel, which was a unique weapon that would be used by the submarine to fire rockets upwards to engage enemy surface ships. The rockets were able to reach about 220 meters, 720 feet, with a speed up to about 116 knots. The launcher would pop up from the deck and automatically be aimed and fired by a sonar system named SP and Larg. This was one of the first underwater self-defense systems ever planned for submarines, but was never finished during the war and was not adapted into submarine designs after the war. Being larger than the Type 7 and 9 classes, this submarine allowed the crews to have more room for living spaces and other commodities. There were still areas of the boats where the crew had to double bunk, however much was improved over previous classes. Two other introductions to the sub were the inclusion of a freezer for storing food and an electric cooker in the galley. So with all these advancements in mind, what happened to the Type 21s? Originally, over 1,000 of these boats were planned, but only 118 of them were actually completed. In many cases, some of the companies contracted for fabrication of sections were completely inexperienced with building ships, and this led to lesser quality products. This was compounded with the rapidly worsening situation of the war, with the Type 21s being the main focus of production for the Kriegsmarine, who demanded the boats be produced as fast as possible. Even with the shipyards putting the boats together as fast as possible, only 2 of the 118 actually saw service before the end of the war, U-2511 and U-3008. Out of these 2, only 2511's commander claimed to have come into contact with an enemy ship in May of 1945. Following the surrender that same month, the Finnish Type 21s became hotly sought out by the Allies. Essentially every power with the Navy wanted one, and they were used for extensive research by each. Following acquisition by the US and Royal Navies, it was found that while the Type 21s were extremely advanced on paper, many aspects of their real-life production limited their capabilities. One of the most important was their hulls, as the demand for quick production by the Kriegsmarine caused many of the modules to be poorly built and result in unacceptable hull strengths. It was reported by the Americans that the structural integrity of the hulls were so bad that they would have been unable to reach worthwhile depths and be unable to survive depth charge attacks. The Americans also found that the torpedo autoloader had hydraulic components located outside of the pressure hull, which was a strange design choice as it would cause them to become corroded from exposure to seawater. As with many of the advanced German technologies developed during the war, the Type 21 was plagued by the German inability to cope with the wartime stresses and the classic disease of being too little too late. Despite these shortcomings, the Type 21 can surely be said to have been the most influential submarine design of the war, and especially that to come out of Germany. Even with the issues related to wartime production, the advancements used in the creation of the class were sound. When I say that the design was influential, I mean that nearly every submarine design from 1946 to 1960 was essentially a derivative of the Type 21's design. In the United States, reverse engineering led to the Guppy upgrades, short for Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, of many of their submarines, particularly the Gato, Baleo, and Tench classes. This upgrade program saw major changes with increased battery capacity, snorkels, and new fire control systems. But the most observable change is the modification of their hulls, incorporating the streamlined design from the 21. You can see that here with these boats. Even the first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus, was built using lessons from the Type 21. The British and Soviets also took heed from the U-boats, with the Soviet Whiskey, Zulu, and Romeo classes being directly influenced. If you are interested in seeing the advances of these subs for yourself, one Type 21 still exists today as a museum ship. In the port of Bremerhaven, Germany, you can find the Wilhelm Bauer, originally U-2540. She was commissioned in February of 1945, but was scuttled just a few months later on May 4th. In 1957, her wreck was raised and put into service in 1960 until 1982. Today, she serves as the most genuine experience one can get of a Type 21. Much like many programs started by Germany in the late wars of World War II, the Type 21 appeared on paper to be a game changer that might give them the ability to change the course of the war. However, this was not to be. Even with its revolutionary changes to submarine design and great improvements over previous U-boats, the Type 21 suffered from the worsening conditions in Germany. Rushed and poor quality construction meant that the boats, even if more were built, would never reach their full potential and most definitely not make any change in the war at sea. While they were not able to achieve their purpose during the war, these boats were able to make a lasting legacy in the history of submarine design. They helped to greatly advance the capabilities of subs and make that great step towards the true submersible ships that we know today. If you found this topic interesting, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next video. I'd also recommend checking out our last video covering another super sub built during World War II by the Japanese, known as the I-400 class, to be used as submersible aircraft carriers. Feel free to drop your recommendations for future topics in the comments below, and thanks for stopping by. Hope to see you back here again on the next episode of Sails and Salvos.